guys, and welcome back to another video. And before we get into today's video, I just want to do the usual. So if you're new here, my name's Amber and I upload beauty, fashion and lifestyle videos, and on a Tuesday I like to do a true crime video. So if they are the type of videos that you like to watch, then why not hit that subscribe button and come along and join my little family. And if you're already part of the family, why not make sure that notification bell is switched on just so you're notified of whenever I upload a video. Why not give me a thumbs up and leave me a comment down below. And now we can get right in. So guys, today I am back with another interesting unsolved case for you this week, and this is actually a very local case to me, so I'm quite excited to be bringing this case forward to you guys. But before we get in and discuss the case, I just want to do a quick little disclaimer to say that I do not mean any disrespect to anyone mentioned in this video. I've literally just compiled together information to create this video for you guys for educational purposes and to inform people about the case. Like I say, this one is still unsolved. It has been unsolved for quite a few years now, and it would be nice to see it solved. Hopefully by getting the information about this case out there, this case might eventually one day be solved. Now we can get right into today's case. So the case that we're going to be talking about today is actually the murder of Ann Heron. Now Ann Heron was actually murdered in a town not far from me, Darlington way, which is literally about half an hour down the road from me. And the reason that I actually found out about this case was actually through my dad. He mentioned it to me, and it's a very interesting case. It's a very sad case, as they always are, but I really wanted to cover it just because my dad had mentioned it. So let's get right in and get started. So I'm just going to give you a quick little backstory about where the case sort of took place, so you can get a little idea of the setting. So Middleton St George is a small village that lies on the main commuter route to Darlington, a borough in North East England. It's a relatively small population, it's a quiet area, and it's only really notable for a few minor points of interest. On August the 3rd, 1990, Ann Heron, who was an affluent mother of three, was found brutally murdered in a pool of her blood in the living room of her isolated luxury cottage Aeolian house on the outskirts of Darlington. Her throat had been slit, possibly by a razor, so it's quite a bloody and brutal case. To this day, like I say, it is unsolved, but Darlington is literally half an hour down the road from me, so it's a very local case. I'm just going to give you a quick little background about Ann and her life before we get into discussing the details of the case. So Ann lived in the beautiful Aeolian house with her husband Peter Heron. It was a large secluded property set off the busy A67 Darlington to Yarm Road, which was near the quiet village of Middleton St George. So the couple met in 1984 while Peter was on a golfing holiday. He was a 49-year-old company director of a haulage firm, and he was on a golfing break with his friends on the Isle of Bute in Scotland. He at the time was actually married to his wife of 20 years, who was called Catherine, and he had 3 daughters with her. The company that he was actually managing was actually doing really well, and whilst on this break, Peter got talking to Ann, who was actually a resident of the Isle herself, and she was a mother of 3 who had been married to a policeman for 15 years called Ralph Cockburn. Peter and Ann literally hit it off straight away. They found out that they had a mutual friend back in Darlington, and after this meeting they actually stayed in touch, and there was a clear mutual attraction between both, even though at the time both were married. So it's quite unclear when the relationship actually formally began between the two, but soon after they had met, Ann decided to visit Darlington to see her friend, and she looked up Peter while she was visiting a friend. An affair between the two then soon followed, and they both left their respective spouses to set up home together. Soon afterwards, they were both divorced from their previous marriages, and Peter and Ann actually married in 1986 at the Yarm Road Methodist Chapel in Darlington, and they had a luxury reception followed nearby at Wynyard Hall, which again is actually very not far from me. I literally drove past there the other day to go to a boot sale, so this tells you how close to home this case is to me. So now I'm just going to get into the events of what actually happened on the day of the murder. So it was the morning of August 3rd, 1990, and Peter had gone to work as usual at the haulage firm that he was working for. The couple were quite wealthy, and Anne did not need to work full time, but she did actually work part time as a care assistant. So the day that she was actually murdered, she wasn't working, but instead she decided to, on the morning, pop to town with her friend to do a little bit of shopping. They were actually shopping for a birthday present for an 18th birthday party that she was supposed to be attending on the evening of the night she was murdered. That afternoon, Peter had come home for lunch. This wasn't unusual for him. He literally worked around the corner, so he quite usually would come home to have lunch with Anne. So Peter arrived home at around 1 p.m. and Anne was also home at this point, and the two had lunch together before he left to return to work just before 2 o'clock. It was an absolutely glorious sunny day. In fact, it was one of the sunniest days on record for 1990. I think it was actually the hottest day in 1990, so it was hot. Anne had decided that she was going to go outside, she was going to take advantage of the sunshine, she was going to throw a bather on, and she was going to lay out and sunbathe. Why not? Soak up the sun rays. So she decided to sunbathe in the grounds of Aeolian House, and she'd set up a sun lounger to catch some rays. So around 6 p.m. it was actually still warm outside, and Peter had arrived home. When he pulled up on the drive, he noticed that Anne's sun lounger was at the front of the house, where she'd moved to avoid any dust being kicked up, because the farmer in the field across from her was ploughing a neighbouring field and there was dust being kicked up, and she didn't want to be covered in dust, so she moved around the other side of the house. The radio was still playing, her cigarettes and lighter were next to the sun lounger, and there was also a half full glass which was laid at the side. When he approached the door, it was actually open. He called out to announce to Anne that he was home, but he didn't get any answer, so he decided to enter through the house. So once he entered through the door, he began to move through the house, and he actually entered the living room and he found Anne lying face down in a pool full of blood, and there was a gaping wound in her neck. Her bikini top was still in place, although the bottoms had been removed. Peter checked to see if Anne had any signs of life, and there was nothing, so he just rang the police to immediately come to the scene. So the police arrived at the scene and they made a thorough investigation. They looked around the scene of the house and on the grounds to see what evidence they could find. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, there was no sign of any ransacking in the house, and basically the house was still impeccably tidy because they were trying to figure out what the motive behind the crime could have been. So there was no sign of forced entry to the house, and the outdoors showed no signs of disturbance, although Anne's book and a pair of shoes were found under a tree about 15 metres away from the sun lounger. The post-mortem report concluded that the estimated time of death was around 5 p.m. and that the cause of death was due to shock and massive blood loss from the wound to Anne's throat. She'd had her throat slit with an implement that the pathologist estimated could have been a cutthroat razor or a work tool such as like a Stanley knife, something like that, but there was no murder weapon found at the scene. There was no sign of any sexual assault, although her pants had been removed, and there was no signs of her being beaten or involved in any struggle. It seemed as though she'd just been killed, then dumped where she lay. It wasn't a robbery and it didn't seem to have been a sex crime. Within the first few months, it was a really intense police investigation. There was more than 7,000 people spoken to and over 4,000 witness statements taken, and there was a surplus of 100,000 man-hours spent hunting Anne's killer. Everyone who knew Anne was spoken to immediately or soon after the crime was committed, and they all echoed the same thing about her. She was attractive, she was well liked, she was popular, she was loved within the community. Everyone who knew her thought that of her. She wasn't found to have any enemies or anyone who would wish her harm. She had no disputes with anyone, and there was no evidence found to suggest she was involved in anything dodgy or that she was having an affair or anything like that. There was absolutely nothing. So collectively, Anne and Peter were actually described as a really happy, comfortably off couple, and again the pair together were well liked. Peter did go on to make a tearful public appeal for anyone who had any information about the identity of Ann's murderer to come forward, and he offered a £5,000 reward. The public and police sympathy for the widower Peter was initially strong, but it did soon begin to turn, and it was replaced with suspicion, and some people even speculated that he either did murder his wife or had something to do with it. So police did begin to look at Peter as a suspect in his wife's murder. As he was both the husband of the victim and the person who had found the body, the police did scrutinise his alibi, and they basically picked through it with a fine-tooth comb, and they really wanted to know what was going on, what he was up to on the afternoon of the murder. That afternoon he claimed that he was in his office from 2 p.m. until 3 p.m. When he left, he attended a meeting with a potential client in a nearby village of Cleveland Bridge until 4:30. Then he headed back to the office. He then left the office at 5 p.m. and headed home, but he didn't head home the way that he would normally travel, and the reason for this would become apparent later on. So he would usually travel through Croft and Middle St George village before arriving home, but this time he took a different route. Although there was a lot of suspicion about his movements and they were questioning them, he wasn't initially arrested as a suspect, and he wasn't questioned, and he was released without charge. However, he wasn't someone who was particularly open about his private life, and when questioned by police, it later emerged that Peter had been having an affair with a barmaid, and that's why he was very, very dicey about why he took that path home, because he didn't want to tell police that he'd been having an affair because it knew it would make him look suspicious. So he'd actually been having an affair with a barmaid at the golf club he was a member of, although he claimed that the affair was coming to an end at the time. His lover was 23 years younger than him and had worked in nearby Croft, and this was the reason he'd not taken the direct route home. He was trying to see his lover on the way home. He was called a murderer to his face by passers-by, and even his daughters were involved in a fight in a local nightclub due to someone making accusations against him. So this crime actually happened 30 years ago this year, and over time there has been several lines of inquiry that have been pursued. So a number of persons of interest that the police wish to trace and eliminate as a result of the investigation were identified, but they were never traced. A male jogger was spotted near the house at the time of the murder, or around the time of the murder. He never ever come forward despite appeals for him to come forward. There was a woman that saw him, and she was surprised that he was running so fast and wearing such long trousers. It was such a hot day. She said the man ran off towards Middleton St George. The police said that they thought the man was a local jogger and said that he might have information that could help the investigation. The jogger was said to have been wearing a blue singlet vest and black shorts or trousers. But like I say, nothing ever came forward. He never came forward, and no more information about this was ever sort of cleared. There was nothing else to go off. So perhaps more crucially, the driver of a blue Ford Sierra was saw speeding out of the driveway of Aeolian House at the estimated time of the murder. The driver was described as being early 30s, extremely suntanned and swarthy looking with dark hair that was longer on the sides than on the top. The car screeched onto the road and swerved around a Volkswagen that was travelling past Aeolian House before accelerating away towards Middleton St George. It narrowly missed a collision with the Volkswagen, and the occupants of that vehicle were supported in their sighting by a passing taxi driver who had to slow down to avoid a collision with an oncoming Sierra. Regrettably, none of the witnesses managed to gain even a part of the vehicle registration number, and the driver was never found. The same blue car was reported sighted parked in a lay-by nearby Aeolian House by another witness, who also provided crucial information years later that suggested Anne may have been out somewhere else on the afternoon of the murder. The witness driving a HGV past Aeolian House at 4:15 p.m. that day, he saw Anne, whom he knew, driving towards him and indicating to turn into the driveway of the house. He flashed his lights at her in acknowledgement, and she waved back in return. The witness noticed two other people in the vehicle with Anne, a male passenger in the seat who had his hands on the dashboard and another person in the back seat. The witness was adamant at what he had seen and was convinced that this was Anne, and another person in a cab at the time confirmed the story. Was this Anne, and if so, where has she been and who was in the car with her? So over the years there's been a couple of minor developments concerning the case. In 1994, an anonymous letter arrived at the offices of the Northern Echo newspaper, and it simply said, "Hello editor, it's me, Ann Heron's killer." Copies were also received by the police and were sent to Peter Heron. The author was never identified, Was this the work of a crank, the killer, or was it sent out on purpose to make out that the killer was still out there? Then many years later, a retired shop worker came forward and offered information about a sales rep that had visited the card shop she worked at in Newton Aycliffe many years before. She said that this man had claimed that he'd killed Ann Heron. The woman, known only as Sylvia, claimed that the rep had gone into the back to talk to the manageress about a possible order. And then she said, they were gone about 10 minutes and he came out first. He looked at me and smiled, although it was a smirk more than a smile. The manageress came behind me and she was physically shaking. She was frightened. She said, you'll never believe what he told me. He told me that he killed Ann Heron, but he was never going to be caught because he was moving to Australia. I don't know why he said it, although the manageress looked a lot like Ann Heron. She wouldn't go to the police saying he was probably just playing silly buggers. It was only years later that I read about the murder, and it really shook me because the description was exactly the same as that of the man seen speeding off in the car from the house. Swarthy, dark, early 30s, it was exactly the same. I know it's just hearsay, but I think the police should have at least interviewed me properly. So again, she was never formally really interviewed, and it's a shame because who knows, maybe he was Ann Heron's killer. But then the most significant, or possibly the most significant development in years since Ann was killed is that 15 years after the murder in 2005, Peter Heron was arrested and charged with Ann's murder. So her husband was actually arrested and charged. And the reason for his arrest was a simple speck of DNA. It had been taken from Ann's body at the time of her autopsy and had been stored as evidence. Through advancements in forensic technology, the sample, which was related to sexual activity, was able after 15 years to produce a genetic fingerprint, and it did, and it was that of Peter Heron. He was arrested and charged with Ann's murder 2 days later on the basis of this evidence, but ultimately the CPS opted not to pursue the charges against him following a review of the forensic evidence. Peter Heron never went to trial and was freed, but has never got his name cleared as he so wishes. There's still a lot of people who do suspect Peter for this. So it has been suggested that maybe Ann was having an affair, and although her family have strongly denied this possibility, many think that it should be considered. Ann and Peter's life together had started as the result of an affair, and he himself was involved in a secret affair at the time of her death. Both had a history of unfaithfulness, and it could be argued that it was a personality trait that is never lost. Was Ann also seeing someone? A secret lover could explain why being in the house was such a familiar layout, whom Ann felt comfortable enough with to be dressed in her bikini. The house wasn't broken into and nothing was stolen, so it does suggest that she possibly did know her killer. Also, Ann did have a dog, and her dog was never reported as barking. It was actually found asleep near her body, so it seemed like the dog was familiar with the person as well, possibly. Some people think that the reason she was maybe murdered was because someone found out that Peter was having an affair with someone else, and in a fit of rage they killed Ann to get back at Peter, which sounds very complex to me, but you know, stranger things have happened. In October 1999, the Crime Watch TV programme, which was broadcast on BBC One, it actually featured a reconstruction of the horrific murder of Ann. So this was shown on telly 2 months after she was murdered. So about 4:45, a blue car, possibly an Astra, was seen outside Ann's house. The camera showed a blue car parked outside Aeolian House, and then they reenacted the moment. 2 witnesses saw the blue car and described its driver as being a suntanned man aged 35 to 45. To this day, neither the car nor the killer has been traced. So a month after the Ann Heron reconstruction on the telly, in November of 1999, Crime Watch actually featured an appeal from the Hampshire Police for information about the whereabouts of a violent prisoner named Michael Benson, who was actually originally from Leeds, which is about an hour away from me, just to give you a bit of perspective, so it's not too far away. Benson had a long criminal history, including burglary, robbery with a carving knife against 3 people, and in December 1972 had been sentenced to life imprisonment for causing grievously body harm with a shotgun in Southampton. The programme said he had escaped while on day release in May 1999, and that summer he had got married. However, he left his wife in May 1990 and disappeared, taking her dark blue metallic Ford Orion. Benson thought he was described as having a Yorkshire accent. He had 3 tattoos on each arm, he was 5'11", and he was using the alias Michael Johnston. He was never recaptured, although it is known that he was on the electrical roll in Leeds in 2005. So people decided to put 2 and 2 together, and Ann's appeal was on Crime Watch in October 1999, and Durham police were saying that they were looking for a dark-haired, suntanned man in his 30s driving a blue car. And then in November 1990, the Hampshire police were looking for a dark, violent prisoner who had absconded with a blue car. Now, there was an award-winning lecturer from York who started to put 2 and 2 together, and she said that neither Durham nor Hampshire had put 2 and 2 together before. Neither of the police forces put these 2 things together and thought, oh, that might actually add up to 4. So she believes that in the summer of 1999, Benson obviously had left his wife and he was on the run, and he had returned as he usually did to his base in Leeds, and then he went searching in a blue car. On July 18th, 1990, 2 weeks before Ann Heron was murdered, 2 women were attacked on the footpath besides the weir in Durham City. Near Prebends Bridge, a man grabbed them from behind and threatened violence. He ran off when they gave him £35 in cash. Police issued a photo fit of a wanted man and told the Northern Echo that he was 30, 5'9", stocky build with dark brown brushback hair and a suntan complexion. That's what the people have been describing this other guy as, that was, you know, implicated in possibly Ann's murder. This lecturer from York has this theory that, you know, Benson was on the run, he was dangerous, particularly to women, and Ann was murdered 25 miles away. Like, it's not that far away. She also said that there are 3 other unsolved murders committed in Yorkshire and Southampton between 1991 and 1998 in which Benson could have been implicated. Now, this is a current, I believe this line of investigation is actually currently open, and it is one of those ones that they are still investigating, because I think it's not long been brought to police attention. The case, even though it is sort of a cold case, is still classed as an open investigation. The next guy that I want to talk about is a guy who is called Christopher Halliwell, and he is known for murdering 2 other women, and some people do suspect that he could have possibly have been Ann's murderer, although again this was not sort of necessarily a formal line of investigation. So Halliwell lived and worked in various northern towns, and he travelled very widely. His father is believed to have lived in Huddersfield and the York area. Halliwell may have visited there. So Middlesbrough and Darlington were certainly within easy travelling distance for him. Middlesbrough's where I'm from. This is, like I say, very close to home. Halliwell worked inherently as a bin man, groundsman, gravedigger, driver and builder. He was a keen fisherman and travelled widely. 1 mile to the southeast of Aon House on A67 there is a very popular fishing venue at Middle and St George's Water Park. Darlington Anglers Club is based at Cleasby and has an approximate 9 miles of river fishing course, and then the River Tees is also known for lots of different types of fish. Basically in this area there's a lot of like places to go fishing, and someone who's an avid fisher would probably take advantage of those places. So Halliwell started his criminal career as a burglar, and he served 3 years in Dartmoor from 1985 to 1987 for car theft and raiding isolated properties for antiques. Aeolian House as a target dwelling fits this aspect of his criminal experience perfectly. The crime was vehicle based, which would fit very well with Halliwell's experience as a car thief and with his modus operandi. Aeolian House is 5 miles from Darlington, about 8 minutes driving time, 15 miles from Middlesbrough along the A67 via Middleton George, about 25 minutes driving time, and 49 miles from York along the A19, then A67 via Middleton St George, which is about 1 hour and 7 minutes driving time. It's also 62 miles from Scarborough along the A171 via Middlesbrough, about 1 hour and 35 minutes driving time. Halliwell was a well-dressed, clean, tidy and persuasive speaker. If he had been passing and seen Mrs Heron in a bikini, he may have been able to talk his way into the house and then conduct an opportunist attack. Wiltshire police are very clear that Halliwell committed other murders. In 1985, Halliwell made remarks to a cellmate that he'd already killed a woman and indicated that he wanted to become a serial killer. The implication being that he was an was active but completely undetected serial killer at the time of Mrs. Heron's murder, which occurred 3 years after his release from HMP Dartmoor. Halliwell was arrested in 2011. He was subsequently convicted of the 2003 murder of Becky Godden Edwards and the 2011 murder of Sian O'Callaghan. Ann Heron's murder in 1990 was long before Halliwell was known to the police for that type of offence, so he would have not been considered as a suspect of the original investigation or any subsequent investigation prior to 2011, when the Heron case was a cold case without detective allocated to it. Halliwell fits the description of the man seen leaving Alien House. He had dark hair and photographs show him tanned. If he was on holiday or working in the area in August, he may have been facially tanned from open fishing. He was 26 or 27 in August 1990, not quite early 30s, but this could be due to an error by a witness. No forensic evidence of any sort was found. Halliwell had a small library of books on forensic science and was forensically aware. He took great pains to ensure he had left no forensic evidence. Cutting someone's throat is a ruthless, brutal and gory act, indicating a man that was proficient with a knife and that had used one before to kill. A surprising number of victims of homicidal cutthroat suffer very little bleeding apart from the post-mortem drainage. If the incision is wide and deep so that the jugular veins are cut, and especially if the victim is upright, air immediately fills the right atrium of the heart and circulation ceases. This process is called an air embolism. A razor could easily inflict such an injury. Halliwell had been a butcher. This would explain why there was no bloodstains seen on the man driving off from Aeolian House. Like I say, this is all speculation, and these are just people that people suspect that could have been involved in the murder. He's never admitted to this murder, there's never been anything to tie him to the case, but he just sort of fits the profile. So Ann Heron's killer has never been brought to justice, and it is now 30 years since she was killed in her home. Well, nearly 30 years in August, so we're approaching the 30-year mark. It's just awful. Like, this lady's murder, like, it needs to be brought to justice, it really does. So Aeolian House is actually now a kennels and a category. Peter Heron decided to sell the house 10 years after the murder, and the family who now own it claim that they feel a presence, albeit not an unfriendly one. Often detect a smell of cigarette smoke, which is strange because none of the occupants of the house are smokers. However, Ann Heron was a smoker, and people suggest, does she still occupy where she spent the final moments of her life? Maybe because she can't be put to rest because the case hasn't been solved, if you believe in that sort of thing. The case actually remains Durham Police's only undetected murder since 1952, but despite this, the case remains open. I find this absolutely incredible that this is actually one of the only Durham Constabulary's unsolved case. In fact, it's the only unsolved murder case. That blows my mind, and I'm like, this needs solving, guys. So that is why I am putting this case out for you guys. I'm sure if you go online, if you have any information about Anne or anything, like, I know it was 30 years ago, but I bet there's people out there who know more. Make sure you contact the police and let them know this lady's family deserve to have her case solved. It's nice for me to do a local one and really spread, you know, information about a local case. I have absolutely, if you want my true thoughts and opinions, I have absolutely no idea about who done this. I genuinely do not think it had anything to do with her husband. I really do not. I just don't. I just don't think. I think the DNA is just coincidental. That could have happened at any point in time. I do struggle to believe that it wasn't someone that she, like, I do feel like it was someone she maybe did know. There's just a lot of things that, you know, like the house being undisturbed and nothing being stolen and things like that, like, do suggest that it was possibly someone that she did know. But I do find that the two criminals that are suspected possibly of her murder, I do find the theories very interesting. I'd love to know what your thoughts and feelings are. Let me know in the comments box down below. Do you think that her husband had anything to do with it? Do you believe it was either of the two suspects that I put forward? You know, give me your theories down below. I'd love to know that. Anyway, guys, I hope you've enjoyed watching this video, and I shall see you in the next one. Mwah, thanks so much for watching.